Well, hello. Thank you for coming to see my virtual presentation. Um, yeah, I hope that you can enjoy it. It means a lot that people stop in and see what I've got to share. So I'm going to be talking about Dr. Couney and eugenics and their competing philosophies over the value of life, specifically dealing with um, preemies or prematurely born babies. It's a really interesting topic that has not been researched a lot, and I found it really fascinating when I went over it, and I hope through this presentation that you will also find it fascinating. So to begin, if you will, imagine that you are living in 1930s America, and you've just come to Chicago because you've heard of this amazing World Fair that's going on. It's 1933. And you come and perhaps along the way you stop and you see the giant German airship that's floating above Chicago, or maybe you stop in and check out the Zephyr, one of the fastest trains in the world at the time. There's a whole bunch of amazing technological advancements that you could observe, or fascinating cultural exhibits that may or may not be accurate. Perhaps you even have an ice cream cone. I don't know. But as you gaze around and walk through, you notice one particularly interesting exhibit. The sign catches your eye. It says, "All the world loves a baby," very cheerfully. And further, it explains baby incubators with living babies right inside here. So you step inside, and inside, along with the nurses and the other attendees, you see dozens of the smallest and most interesting babies you've ever seen, each in their own display case. It's a kind of strange sight, isn't it? Certainly to our modern eyes, this is weird. It's not normal to put babies on display. So how did we get here, and how and why was this happening? That's what we're here to discuss. So to get into these babies, first we really need to talk about the eugenics movement and give background to that. So eugenics, the term and the science, was coined by Sir Francis Galton in 1869. Sir Galton was an Englishman, and at the time he called it the science of improving stock, or giving the more suitable races of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable. Eugenics was thought to be the ultimate extension of evolutionary and scientific thought. The thinking was, by culling the weak, the strong would have a better chance to thrive, and society would be improved through that. So just like in the evolutionary model, the fittest survive and make a better animal or whatever. That's what he thought we should do with society. This movement certainly had significant influence in the Western world. On the left, you can see a piece of propaganda. So eugenics is the tree, and then each of the roots is labeled with a science or some kind of thing that was informing eugenics. The idea is eugenics is built on top of all of these sciences that are supporting it. That's not exactly a fair representation in reality, but that was their messaging. This is a scientific thing, and they were saying that this is the ultimate expression of social strength. So hopefully the problems are apparent with such thinking, among other things, which we don't have time to go into all of the problems with eugenics, but it raises such questions as who decides what makes a more suitable race? That's a really subjective idea. And it also assumes an unequal value of life. Some people are worth more than others according to this thinking. And even if the initial idea was noble, which there are some problems with that thinking, it was quickly co-opted by others to serve racist and classist means. Um, and it also was built on faulty sciences. So you know that picture with the tree where all the roots are different sciences? Much of that was pseudoscience. Things that sound right, but are not factually correct, and certainly would pass over other things, such as, you know, the morality of it. That's just wasn't discussed by eugenics. So perhaps the most poignant example of how this can go wrong is seen in Nazi Germany. Eugenics was used by the Nazis as a justification for race-based violence. They used, as you can see on the picture on the right-hand side, there's a man getting his nose measured. They used physical measurements of different races to justify why Germany and Germans were the best, and why they should have the right to rule over others and the right to kill off those who weren't as well suited as they. Unfortunately, eugenics did not just stay in Europe. It did come to America, and this is not talked about as much. But beginning in the early 20th century, the eugenics movement really found significant influence in America. There was an American Eugenics Society. On the top left, you can see the winners of a fitter family competition. So they would have competitions that would they would judge them on the size of the family, the health, and like overall attractiveness, and a whole bunch of other subjective things. And the goal was to stimulate positive social movement, to make people want to be better, I guess. And they did the same with babies. They had better baby competitions all across the US. So this was not an uncommon thing. On the bottom left, you can see some of their propaganda, some of their messaging. The left, it says, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And that's the kind of thinking that they wanted to promote. So the positive eugenics is like the fitter family competitions, you know, awarding the best. Negative eugenics is the darker side. It's had a lot worse consequences. So negative eugenics focused on removing the unfit from the gene pool. It had it had goals as subjective as removing feeble-mindedness and criminality, which, you know, you really have to stretch to find a genetic connection there. And even more, I guess, noble aspirations, such as trying to get rid of polio and bipolar. Again, that's based on a lot of pseudoscience. There are genetic connections with those disorders, but not to the extent that they would have you believe, and it certainly isn't as easy as you know, just making sure some people don't have kids. So they did use propaganda films. Are You Fit to Marry was one. So it was actually titled The Black Stork initially, but those two titles are of the same film. And the film tells the story of a mother who has a kid, who's a child with a genetic defect, and she decides to let the child die. And at the end of the film, she's like wrestling back and forth. What should she do with this kid? Because she doesn't want to be a burden on society, and she doesn't want the kid to grow up to be a suffering existence, to have a suffering existence. And so eventually she lets him die, and the last thing she sees is Jesus receiving the child into heaven. And of course, the messaging there is it's better to let children with genetic disorders, it's better to let them die than to continue living with the condition they have, and potentially to carry that on to the next generation. Certainly, if you have a genetic disorder, you should not be procreating. That's part of the messaging there. So this is for the good of society, but also for the good of those who are suffering. Unfortunately, the influence of negative eugenics did not just stop at words and opinions. There were laws in place that enforced these ideas. over 60,000 Americans were sterilized by force. And a lot of this was, petty criminals would be forced to be sterilized, if they got caught robbing something, that would happen at times. Illegal immigrants sometimes. Often these laws targeted the disabled, the poor, and petty criminals. Even one of our Supreme Court justices, Wendell Holmes, said it's better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. So this was a very influential man who was in charge of making the of deciding what is right in our land, and that was his opinion. There were doctors, such as Dr. Harry Heselden, who openly allowed infants he deemed defective to die. Obviously, well, maybe it wasn't obvious, but that would be with the parents' consent, but he was pressuring them to do so. And also, he did this openly. He even invited press to come report on it. It did lead to problems later in life for him, but that's something that he did. Certainly, negative eugenics had an extensive influence in America. So what does this all have to do with Dr. Couney and the sideshows that we talked about at the beginning, the baby exhibit? So premature babies were considered the same as those born with genetic defects. They were considered to be weaklings, and a lot of people thought that society would be better if they were not allowed to live, or if we didn't go through the effort of trying to save them. So helping that was the fact that at the time, there was not a viable way to save these babies. Hospitals did not have a very high success rate with saving premature babies, and often they were just given up for, if they were born prematurely, they just weren't going to make it. So coupled with not having the infrastructure or knowing how to save these babies, that coupled with should we even save these babies, those two things really made neonatal care, or the care of preemies, really underdeveloped in America. And the eugenic strain of thought really did influence the amount of time and money spent investing in how to care for these babies, because, well, we'll see what Couney does. So Dr. Martin Couney, I've referenced him. You probably haven't heard of him before. So who is he? Unfortunately, much of his personal story is unknown. There's not a lot written about him. There's literally one book and a half dozen articles of real scholarly value. So we do know he is European. It seems either Western French, or Western France, or Eastern Germany. That's kind of where he's come from. But there's multiple stories on his birthplace. His name is deceiving. He's not. So there's significant proof that he is not actually a doctor. That seems to be something that he said to give himself credibility. And Couney is also not his last name. It was something else in his homeland, and he changed it to better fit and to sell his babies better. So he came to Omaha, Nebraska in 1898, and with him he brought a whole new way of neonatal care to American hospitals, or that American hospitals did not have before, I should say. Incubators is what he used, but he used a different kind of incubator than what had previously been seen in America. It was not his design. Another doctor had designed it in Europe, but he was bringing it to America. And you can see on the right-hand side, there is an image of one of the incubators with a baby inside. It's a glass display, so people could see inside and look at the babies. But these incubators allowed Dr. Couney to keep the baby safe in a way that hospitals did not. So hospitals used warm rooms at the time because that was a lot easier to take care of. But it couldn't achieve the same results that Dr. Couney's incubators did. And part of the reason for that was sterilization. So in his incubators, Dr. Couney was really rigid about the cleanliness of his exhibits and just the care for his baby. So he made sure that everything was absolutely sterile. He used breast milk instead of cow milk, as some other medical professionals did. This is really important because babies did not have the ability to digest cow milk properly. And his exhibits were staffed with professionals. They were staffed with nurses and doctors. So he always had a doctor on staff who would sign things for him, even if he was not himself a doctor. So Dr. Couney's sideshows or baby exhibits were a very unconventional idea, one that we cringe at kind of today, but they really worked. He displayed all around the country for 40 years. Primarily, he did so at Coney Island in New York. But he did this for 40 years, so that tells you something about the long-lasting appeal of his work. According to Dr. Couney, these are his numbers, all the world did indeed love a baby. He claims to have over 1.5 million visitors throughout his time of having the baby exhibits. And he claimed to have 8,000 babies that were on display at one time or another. So one question that might be on your mind is how did he get the babies? So it's not the most clear thing, but I think mothers often asked for Dr. Couney to take their babies. So when a baby was born prematurely in a hospital, the chance of him living, or her, I guess, was minimal. So Dr. Couney was a better alternative. And sometimes babies would be abandoned at hospitals if they were born prematurely, simply because, again, you have to consider the social view on preemies. They were not likely to survive, and so why get your hopes up for something that wasn't going to happen? So Dr. Couney's sideshows did draw certain responses. This is from a prestigious medical journal. A doctor wrote in, "Is it in keeping with the dignity of science that incubators and living babies should be exhibited among the Aunt Sallies, the merry-go-rounds, the five-legged mule, the wild animals, the clowns, the penny peep shows, and amidst the glare and noise of a vulgar fair?" It's a good question. It's probably not. So here he's kind of being accused of treating preemies as subhuman, which I think is a valid concern. He is treating them as though they are something abnormal, something that's, you pay a quarter to go see. It's not as dignified as it should be. And one of the other problems that arose was imitators. So other people took his idea and had their own shows in different fairs or different places, and they did so poorly. Often they were more about the money. Often they did not properly care for the babies, and you can see in the survival rates that these other sideshows did not nearly have the success that Dr. Couney did in actually saving the babies. So as I kind of mentioned before, often the choice for mothers or for these hospitals caring for these babies is often sideshow or a much higher chance of death. Dr. Couney's exhibits were the finest medical care a preemie could receive. And he received over 8,000 babies. In his time, he saved 6,500 of those 8,000. So that's a really high percentage for prematurely born babies who did not have a high chance of living otherwise. And perhaps his more important contribution was his influence on future developments. So one of the leading experts on neonatal care or preemie care is Julius Hess. So Dr. Hess was he looked up to Dr. Couney as his teacher and as a mentor, and really credits him for helping him develop these ideas. One of the things that Dr. Couney openly said he was doing was creating propaganda for the preemies. So in 1939, Dr. Couney's last show happened, And unfortunately for him, it ended in financial ruin, and his life actually ended with massive debt. So that's a sad personal note. But his show ended, and he made the comment, I have made propaganda for the preemies, and now my work is done. And he said that because in that same year, a New York hospital opened the country's first preemie care division, so a special care division dedicated especially to preemies. Dr. Couney's work, kind of, was complete. So the question is, why did, if these incubators were so effective and Dr. Couney was able to save so many lives, why did Dr. Couney have to display his babies at fairs across the country for 40 years just to change a medical care practice that was clearly working? Well, I'll bring you this quote. This quote comes from a medical journal, the Buffalo Medical Journal, and it was an anonymous submission. It says, the question naturally presents itself as to whether this is worthwhile, whether the race as a whole does not suffer from the preservation of these weaklings to perpetuate their kin. Medical science is a little illogical because in its efforts to preserve the individual, it forgets to consider the effects of such action upon the race as a whole. So that's clearly a eugenic strain of thought in the medical community. And that's the kind of thing that Dr. Couney was up against. Is it even worth saving these babies? Yeah, Dr. Couney vehemently said yes. He countered such arguments by citing famous figures such as Napoleon, Sir Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin. You can argue about the morality of Napoleon, for example, but the influence of these men is certainly vast. They are, huge men in our history books, and they were born prematurely. So if these men can be prematurely and rise to become what they were, then isn't it worth saving all of these babies, because who knows what they will contribute to society? That was his logic. And in general, he used his sideshows as a counter argument to what they were saying. He thought that by people seeing these babies and seeing them in person, seeing all of those tiny lives, that people's opinions would be changed. He thought that by bringing openly and obviously bringing attention to the plight of these babies, how they had to go to fairs to receive medical attention, he thought that would change the medical community's ideas. And it kind of did. So the fight for America's tiniest citizens was winding to a close by the time of his death in 1950. In World War II, the Nazis had just been defeated, and so the horrors of some of the eugenic strains of thought had been uncovered, and also the medical community was beginning to take over Dr. Couney's work, and it was becoming the business of the hospitals to provide that specialized preemie care. So in the end, though preemies are tiny, their value was seen as great as Dr. Couney wanted it. So thank you so much for joining this presentation. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you have, I guess, a newfound appreciation for the medical care that we have today. And I would love to answer any questions. I think there's going to be a way to set that up. I don't know. But thank you all for joining me. Here are my image references and then the text references that I used. So thank you so much and have a great day.